All right, there we go. All four sides cut out. Not perfectly square, but not too bad. Rather sharp edged all the way around the inside. So let's just fix that up with the axe file. Just forward strokes only is what I'm doing to work with the file instead of against it. It's coming. It's going to take a few strokes to get this finished. So I'll work at this and clean it up, and we'll start on with the next phase. Okay, finished, complete, smooth, no sharp edges, nothing to catch my fingers on. Not convinced this is the best size hole. I may make it bigger yet, but what I am going to do is, like I said, I will try this stove out and see if it works for me with the size hole that it is. If I'm not happy, I can always make it larger. That was the hardest part of this entire stove build. Once you get that hole cut, everything else is going to come pretty easy. So the next step is probably one of the easiest, and that is putting some legs on the bottom. Now, just a word about legs or standoffs or whatever else you want to call them. You can do any number of things to make this effective. I chose to use little tiny lightweight angle braces, 3/4 inch, to give it that little bit of a lift off of the ground. I've seen some much more elaborate ones where things have been attached to the side, either swing out legs or pieces that come out at an angle. Probably more effective in that they will provide a more stable base. Obviously, the wider the base and the wider the pot stand on top, the more stable the entire stove will be, especially if you're using this outdoors on the ground. I decided to go with something a little smaller, a little bit more compact for this reason. Compactness, so that I can get this in a bag inside my pack without having a much larger pot because of the leg standouts. Also because it was simple, easy, and inexpensive to do. So what do we need to do? I have 4 machine screws, lock washers, and nuts. You'll notice on the bottom of the utensil strainer there is a grid pattern of holes. And what I choose to do is find one of the corner holes. If I can do that. There it is, hard to see from inside. And so I brought my machine screw from the inside out. Reason being is that gives me the flattest surface with the least amount of protrusion into the stove itself from the inside. So I brought the machine screw out from the outside. I placed one of the angle braces on, lock washer, and nut. And I'm going to tighten that down. Start it with my fingers, finish it with a pair of pliers and a screwdriver. I have to lay this down so I can stabilize it somewhat. Get started. There we go. All right. Turning the angle brace to the outside, you can see what I've done. I'm going to put the 4 of them on, tighten them up, and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm finished. Okay, there are the finished support legs on the bottom of the stove, and they're set off from 3/4 inch. Now, I will tell you that once I was finished, I took my pliers and I bent them out just ever so slightly, not farther than the side of the stove itself. And my reason for doing that is I want to make sure this will fit inside a cloth stuff sack once I'm finished. So yes, you can make them larger, you can make them wider, and the wider they are, the more stable the stove will be. But for compactness and being able to get this into my backpack without any protrusion sticking out that's going to catch, that's as big as I need to make it. That's as tall as it has to be, really. It doesn't have to be very tall off of the ground, so 3/4 inch is just fine. Now these came with a nice smooth edge already on them because of what they are, the little angle brackets for use on furniture like shelving. So I don't need to do any smoothing work over the edge of those, and that will sit nice and steady on the ground. Now you have to keep in mind you're going to be using this sometimes on unlevel ground, sometimes on soft ground as well. So you have to keep in mind where you're going to set this to make sure that you can get as stable a platform as possible. We will be using a piece of aluminum sheeting on the bottom to give it that protection from the earth, so that again will hold it up off the ground. You do have to be cautious about how stable you can make this on the ground before you lay a pot, because this is starting to become a bit of a tall assembly here. Okay, Just about finished. Last thing to do to make this stove fully effective is to put the pot stand across the top. So I went back to my workshop and I found a shorter piece of that same aluminum bar stock from a previous project, and I measured it out and it's just over 11 1/4 inches. So I took my ruler, went to the middle, and with a sharp edge, not a marker at this point because I'm trying to be as precise as possible, a sharp metal edge, I scribed a small center point on the bar. Now I'm going to cut this bar in half, but before I do, I want to make sure that I can get this as, where are we? Here we are. Turn it over this way to do it. Scribe a line right on that mark using my square. Because I'm using metal on aluminum, it scribes quite readily. And that's going to be my guide. I don't think that'll show up on the camera, but that'll be my guide for cutting. I'm going to be using a hacksaw, which is a tool I did not show you, but of course I think most people know what a hacksaw is. So give me a second. I'm going to cut this in half so I have two identical pieces of aluminum stock the same length. Now, why this length? Well, really, you only need the pot stand to be wider than the stove itself. So the stove itself is just, I'm measuring it at about 4.5 inches across the center. So even if I went as short as a 5-inch pot stand, it would work. Barely, better off with a 6-inch pot stand. So this is going to be just short of 6 inches on each side. This will work just fine for the stove. A little larger might have been better, but I just wanted to make sure I used up a piece of existing stock and it didn't go to waste. So I'll cut that and I'll come back and I'll show you the next step. Okay, next step. I have 2 bars of 1-inch wide aluminum stock cut to precisely the same length, and I just smoothed off the edges with my file and a little bit of sandpaper, so again there was nothing to catch my fingers or anything else with. You can round them a little bit if you want, not necessary. Aluminum's very forgiving that way. By the way, it doesn't have to be aluminum stock for this. I just find aluminum the easiest to work with, lightest to have, and it seems to, especially the width of this material here, seems to stand up well to the heat. So they are precisely measured. Now, next step, take one of them, find the exact center, scribe a line. So what I've done is I've scribed a line right down the center of this 1 bar stock. I also know that this bar stock is 1 inch wide, so I laid my ruler on it and I marked exactly 1 inch. Now what you'll see is I have colored in a small portion of that line, half the line, with my permanent marker. I am going to cut right down the center of that magic marker to exactly the center of this bar. But I'm not going to cut just this bar, I'm going to cut both of them at the same time. That way I know that they'll be exactly in the same spot. And so what I'll do is I'll put the 2 of them together. I'm going to place them in my vise, clamp them, make sure they're exactly centered on top of each other. And for this, I am going to use my angle grinder. And the reason I'm going to use my angle grinder is because I can make a wider cut line, or kerf if you will, with the angle grinder that I can with either a hacksaw or a Dremel tool. Now this is where things start to get, well, can be a little tricky if you're not paying attention to what you're doing. I've made mistakes with this before, so I'm just sharing my experience with you. Cut just halfway down through both bars at the same time. I'm going to stop there, do that, come back and show you what the next step is after that. So I'm going to use my angle grinder. I want the kerf wide enough so that in the end what I'm going to have is 2 bars, one that will go over the top of the other. So they have to be at least as wide as the metal is itself. So that's why I'm using the angle grinder to do this with. In fact, when I use the angle grinder, my cutoff wheels are fairly thin. I may have to cut down and move a little bit to the side just to make sure that I get it wide enough. And the only way to know that for sure is to stop, take them apart, test them. If it's not ready, make sure you go back and cut in a little bit. A little bit loose is better than a little bit too tight, and you'll see why in a few minutes. All right, I'll stop there and I'll bring it back when I'm ready for the next step. All right, progress so far. My 2 bars of metal, yes, I still have the label on that one. I'll take that off before I'm finished with it. And here's where we are. We have a slot dead center in both of these bars, a little wider than the bar itself. Now I could have been a little bit more precise, but I allowed it to go a little wider, and there's actually benefit for doing that because I find when they get hot, sometimes they will be a little bit more difficult to put together. So here's the reason why. So 2 bars, 2 slots, halfway through the bar each. When they go together, they form a perfect X. So that perfect X, smooth right across the top in both directions, will allow for a nice steady pot stand. So I mentioned earlier that cutting the hole in the side of the stove was the hardest part. This is not hard, but this is probably the most time-consuming part, because once you get that center cut, you have to work it back and forth to get it wide enough to allow the bar to set down inside. So it took a little bit of time for me to do that, and then I just finished it off with some sandpaper to get rid of the sharp edges once again, make it a little easier to go together. My experience has been, if you're a little bit loose, you're better than being too tight when it comes to getting these things together. And that goes to the next step, which is take one of your bars, and now we have to put this across the center as best we can. If you're able to measure it with some measuring device and get the exact center, even better. You're going to take that one bar and mark 2 lines on it. On the edge where it would overlap the outside of the stove, scribe it on both sides, allowing for, I could have done a better job of that, I think, just allowing for the even amount of overhang on both sides. And once again, I'm going to, so I have a scribe mark here and a scribe mark here. I'm going to measure them halfway through the bar again. Now here's the trick so you don't mess up. You're going to cut them both again, both ends on both bars at the same time, but instead of cutting them together like this, one of them is going to be upside down. And I'll just bear it so you can see where the marks are. So on one side, I've got the slot up. On the other side, I've got the slot facing down. And the reason being is once we go to put it back together, the cuts that I'm going to put in this are going to match up so there's not upside down, and they'll be able to fit on top of the stove stand. So I'm going to mark those and cut those, and I'll show you that before we put it together. Okay, here we are. I have the bars cut with notches on each of the outside ends. They are cut quite wide right through here on both ends so that they'll fit over the lip of the stove. So here's what they look like from that angle. And here's what they look like when they go together. There's quite a bit of clearance, quite a bit of play inside those bars. And my experience has been that that is actually beneficial. Trying to get it too precise and too tight a fit actually makes it a little difficult to get together sometimes, especially when they're sooted. If they start to warp a tiny bit from the heat, they get a little more difficult to get together. And that applies to the outside notches as well. You want them loose enough that you can get them on the stove with very little fuss. So there you can see they sit on top of the stove quite nicely and quite loosely. And the reason why you want them to be a little loose is, more often than not, when you start your fire in these, you're starting and you're loading it from the top. You may be doing a top-down burn, but you're not ready to put these on just when you start the fire. So you're going to want to get the fire burning in the stove, and then you want to come along and quickly lay that on top. If it doesn't go on, if it sits sideways because you didn't make those notches loose enough, then you got to fiddle either with a stick or with a multi-tool or something to try to get it on. So it's nice if they're just a little bit loose. It'll work just fine as a pot support. Okay, lessons learned in cutting these things. Aluminum is not difficult to cut, certainly much easier than steel, which is the reason why I chose it for this project. But it is difficult to get these both wide enough and at the proper depth when you're cutting with hand tools. I did start off with a angle grinder, but then I moved over to files to try to get the preciseness both in width and in depth. So the files helped immensely. Even so, I went a little deeper than I wanted to, and that's one of the things you have to watch, is that you don't go too deep. Really, you don't have to go very deep at all for this to work. I'm left with a little less than a ½ inch clearance off of the top of the stove. That's enough, but a little bit more clearance would have been even better. So if I had cut into the bar just a ½ inch and that's all I really need, just enough so that it will sit on top of the stove itself, then I would have had just that much more clearance off the top of the stove. As it is, these will work just fine for this project. They go on quickly, easily, and they provide a nice stable pot support. Small pot, like a GSI cup, right up to a larger pot will sit on top of these with great stability. Now, I did mention I used aluminum. Could I have used another material like steel? Absolutely. Bar steel would have worked just as well. In fact, it may be a little stronger, if heavier, than these aluminum bars are. I chose the aluminum bars because they're much easier to work with the tools that I have, and easier to notch out. I may be a concern about warpage. You know, my experience has been that these stoves, while they do get very hot, they're not so hot that they're going to bend and warp these, if maybe ever so slightly, but I haven't found that it's made it so much of a warp or a bend in it that it won't go on top of the stove again the next time I go to use it. All right, let's wrap this up. Okay, we're well underway in our stove project now. We have our Ikea utensil strainer with a feed hole cut in the side, down near the bottom. We have a couple of, or 4, small feet on it to hold it off of the ground, and we have our pot rest on top. Is it ideal? No, I could have done a better job at this, and that's one of the things you want to keep in mind is when you're doing this, this will work just fine, very functionally. I would like to have done a little bit better job, especially with the crossbars, just making sure they were up a little taller than they are, but they're going to work just fine for this project. Okay, there's the stove complete. Let's put that aside. Now, next, let's work on making the pot. But I won't be doing it in this video. I'll put another video together where I make the pot and we'll assemble the whole cooking set together. So if you're interested in watching the next one, stay tuned. But in the meantime, get out and explore. Take that path less traveled. It'll make all the difference. Bye for now.